Hi all, welcome back. This time out, we're going to talk about how we sustain contractions over a long period of time. Last time we were talking about recruiting motor neurons and or motor units and how that works as you increase the number of contractions or increase the activity level, the more motor neuron um, that will be firing. Well, we're going to get into kind of what that means, and we'll talk about the different types of muscle fibers also. So first off, let's talk about those motor units. So the motor units can be what we call a small diameter axon, okay, or a large diameter axon. If it's a small diameter axon, it typically is recruited first. So this is the initial stimuli, and then afterwards we might have large motor units. So if you need fast recruitment, fast response, you'd have a small motor unit be initiated first, and then if you need maybe a sustained response, a sustained contraction, you might have a bunch of large motor units afterwards. Okay? You can have a combination of both, and that's typically how we sustain a contraction, is you get a combination of both. And we talked about this a little bit before. You can get a summation of contractions. And so the graph that I showed last time, where you saw there's a stimulation and then a little bump on the graph, and then another stimulation and a bump a little higher, and another stimulation, and it kept going up. Okay, you're not allowing the muscle to completely relax. It's being stimulated enough that the contractions are occurring in a summation, and along with that, you can get recruitment of both smaller motor units and larger motor units over a period of time. So the contraction can continue to drive movement or work or muscle contractions. Okay? Now, one way that this works is by having what we call muscle tonus, and that is that when your muscles are at rest, they're still being contracted. There's still a partial contraction at different regions along the muscle. They're still firing. Okay? And this state allows for us to move into a recruitment and a summation period much quicker. And we'll talk about how that works a little bit later. Okay? So types of contractions. Okay, there are two main types of contractions that I want to talk about. One is called isotonic, which means that the muscle contracts and it changes length. Okay, so the muscle fiber changes length. Either it shortens or elongates. Okay, but under equal force. That's the iso part. Iso means equal. Okay? There are two ways at which this can occur. You can have concentric reactions where the muscle is shortening. Okay, so the fibers get closer together, or at least the Z points get closer together. Okay, and that occurs when you actually pick an object up. And so the eccentric is the opposite. You lengthen, the fibers get further away. And so this is normally the reverse of a concentric reaction. So let's say you pick up a dumbbell and you flex, okay, that's concentric. Then you let it go back down, that's eccentric. The stretching of the muscle is eccentric. The contraction of the muscle or the shortening of the muscle is concentric. And the lengthening of the muscle is eccentric. Okay? Another way at which we can have a contraction is what we call isometric. And that's when the muscle doesn't change its length, but it still stimulates. Okay, it's still stimulated, and the muscle will flex. Okay, so if you flex your muscle but don't move your arm, Okay, so you're just flexing your bicep, you're doing an isometric contraction. Okay, there's no movement of the fibers, they're the same equal length. Okay, and that's where you iso meaning equal again, metric mean measurement, so equal length. That there's no shortening or lengthening of the contraction. Okay, we can look at this. So concentric contraction, again, if we're moving, if we're curling that uh, weight, okay, that bicep is getting shorter. The fibers are getting shorter. Okay, and then when we release and we let it go back down, okay, that's eccentric contraction. It's lengthening. If we just hold on to a bar or hold on to something and flex, that's isometric contraction. All right, so your muscles in general, remember they're wrapped in the fascia and you have lots of little fibers, and we already talked about what those fibers are, those actin filaments and myosin filaments, okay? But there are also different types of fibers, okay? And so you can have what we call slow fibers or slow twitch muscles or fast twitch muscles. Okay. On top of that, the energy source that that muscle uses will determine what type of muscle you might have in a certain region. So, does it need oxygen? Is it oxidatively? So that means it has to have oxygen present in order for that muscle to fire. Is it glycolytically? So meaning that it runs through glycolysis and no oxygen is needed. It's an anaerobic muscle. Okay. And then what's the amount of force? Does it generate lots of force, or is it reactive? So it's a fast muscle, but doesn't generate a lot of force. Is it resistant to fatigue, meaning that it utilizes lots of energy for a long period of time, or is it quick and uses fast energy, but it fatigues early in a time period? Okay. Now, for the most part, all your muscles will have a little bit of both, but you have predominant muscle types in different regions. Okay, so you might have a region that's dominated by fast, glycolytically activated muscles, and then you might have another region that's slow, oxidatively um, muscles. And so it really just depends on what that muscle is used for, how much of each you're going to have. And there's quite a few other types or varieties than the ones that I just mentioned. Yeah. But let's talk about slow twitch first. Okay, sometimes they're called type 1 muscles or slow oxidative muscles, or abbreviated SO. Um, and these are always oxidative, so they have to have oxygen, so they're associated with lots of myoglobin. Okay? They also are associated with lots of red blood cells. They resist fatigue, so it takes a long time for them to fatigue. Okay? They have lots of mitochondria. Remember, if you have oxygen need, mitochondria is the site of cellular respiration. That's where energy is generated. Okay, they don't burn through ATP very fast. Okay, so it takes a while for these to contract. So their contract um, is slow. It's a slow muscle. Okay, but once it contracts and starts that contraction process, it doesn't fatigue very often. Okay, or not as often as maybe a fast twitch muscle. They tend to be smaller in diameter than the fast twitch fibers. Okay? And for the most part, it depends obviously on the organism. In us, because we utilize our legs for movement, for locomotion, our leg muscles are slow twitch muscles. Okay? And if you want to kind of see the difference, if you look at a turkey, for example, and you look at the legs of a turkey, which also uses its legs as locomotion, that turkey's leg will be brown meat or dark meat. Okay, that's the myoglobin, and then the mitochondria and the increased blood supply, which causes that meat to be dark. Okay? Those muscles are slow, but they resist fatigue. Okay? Versus a fast twitch muscle, like a type 2, either normally a type 2B, fast glycolytic muscles, they only do glycolysis. Okay, so not oxygen. Because there's no oxygen relation, there's no need for myoglobin, there's no need for mitochondria, and they have very poor blood supply. Okay. They're susceptible to fatigue because if you're just using glucose and you're burning through, you're not generating much ATP. Okay? But because you don't need to wait for oxygen to get to the region, you're a fast muscle. You can be activated extremely fast. So you can contract rapidly, although you're going to fatigue out pretty fast, but you can contract a lot faster. So muscles that we use often, and we don't want to have to wait or store a bunch of myoglobin and things like that, like your eyes and your hands. Okay, muscles that we don't use for locomotion and things like that, like certain arm muscles and certain leg muscles, are also fast twitch muscles. Okay. This, if you're looking at, say, a turkey, this would be the white meat on the turkey, the breast meat. Domestic turkeys don't typically fly, so they don't use that breast meat or those breast muscles for movement. So they tend to be white fibers because there's no myoglobin or very little, and there's a lot less blood supply and mitochondria to the region. Fast twitch type 2 is going to be an oxidative, or the FO fibers. Sometimes these have been called intermediate twitch fibers, and they are like characteristics of both SO and FG, so slow, oxidative, and fast glycolytic fibers. Okay? They are kind of the best of both worlds. Okay, they can contract quickly and they can sustain a longer period of time, so they don't fatigue as fast. They have an intermediate amount of pretty much everything. Intermediate amount of myoglobin, intermediate amount of mitochondria, intermediate amount of blood supply. But the nice thing about them is they're fast to fire and they're resistant, or a little bit more resistant to fatigue than fast twitch type 2B muscles. Okay. All right, now what happens if we don't, or we do use a muscle more often? Right? How do you build muscle? How do you get bigger muscles? Okay, and the enlargement of skeletal muscles, okay, is called hypertrophy. Okay? So you can go through hypertrophy and enlarge your skeletal muscles, or atrophy, okay, and decrease the muscles, which is called atrophy or atrophy, but normally people call it atrophy, and that will decrease the size of your skeletal muscles because they're not being used. Okay? Again, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about bones. If you're not going to use them, or you're not associated your bone with stress, then the bone material doesn't get laid down. It's a similar process as skeletal muscle. If you're not using it, then the fibers deteriorate and you go through atrophy. If you use it a lot, you go through hypertrophy or hypertrophy. Aerobic exercise will stimulate slow twitch fibers, as you can imagine. Hey, if you're going through aerobic exercise, meaning that you're doing things like running on a treadmill and things like that, where you're doing a activity, constant motion, maybe not high strain or anything like that, you're going to typically stimulate those muscles that need oxygen, and they'll start to become bigger and better at responding. Right? The opposite is true. Right? If you want to build big, fast twitch muscles, right? Normally forceful exercise, okay? Lifting of weights, heavy weights, okay? Not aerobic exercise, but heavy weights will tend to enlarge those muscles. Okay, so you have both types, and in all regions you have both types, both aerobic and aerobic muscles. And when this occurs, like these forces and utilizing them often, okay, you're going to produce new actin myosin filaments. You're going to enlarge the muscles. You're going to make the muscles better at responding to stimuli and all kinds of situations when it comes to um, um, like exercise and exercise physiology. Okay. Okay, the last piece I want to talk about a little bit is smooth muscle. Okay, so we talked about skeletal muscle. It's by far the most common muscle, and majority of the muscles that you might injure and things like that are skeletal muscle. Okay. But smooth muscle is important. Again, when we compare it to skeletal muscle, okay, there's a few differences that we need to know. So first of all, smooth muscle are shorter. They have a single nuclei. Remember, skeletal muscles are elongated with multiple nuclei. Okay, they are elongated, but they taper. Their ends taper off. Okay, so it's not a sarcomere. It's not ending, attaching to another skeletal muscle cell. The myofilaments are randomly organized inside the cell, and we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. Okay, there's no striations. Okay, they lack the transverse tubules. Okay, there's no reason for transverse tubules because the electrical impulse is not generated by you. You don't have any control over smooth muscle fibers. And most of the time, when we're looking at smooth muscles, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is not very well developed. Okay? They still have a calcium associated with this sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it's not a good storage unit for calcium in smooth muscle. Okay? Two main types of smooth muscle: multi-unit smooth muscle. Okay? And so these cells are less organized. They tend to overlap. And they'll function as separate units. Fibers are independent of each other. So certain regions of the body, like the iris of the eye, has quite a bit of multi-unit smooth muscle. They tend to be stimulated by both neurons and hormones. Okay. Visceral or single unit smooth muscle cells respond as a unit, okay? And so you can have a sheet of muscles. They tend to be arranged in a more uniform order, okay? And so they're held together by gap junctions, which are basically communication junctions, okay? And they can react to a stimulus as a rhythmic and fire in kind of a pulse, okay? So things like your organs, like your intestines, your stomach, this kind of stuff would have visceral or single unit smooth muscle associated with it. Okay, so here you can kind of just see that visceral, you can see they're occurring in kind of sheets. There's not overlapping. Okay, it only takes, one anatomic neuron to kind of stimulate the entire sheet versus, the multi-unit smooth muscle where you have each cell is stimulated by a neuron to get that contraction to occur. Okay. All right. How does it resemble skeleton muscle? Well, it interacts. There's an interaction between actin and myosin. Both use calcium and ATP. Both are triggered by membrane impulses. Okay. How's it differ? Lots of ways. So they lack troponin. They use calamodin instead. Okay, so that's one way that they are quite a bit different. There are two neurotransmitters for smooth muscle. Acetylcholine, same neurotransmitter as you see in skeletal muscle, but now neuroepinephrine is another one that will transmit a reaction from smooth muscle. Okay, again, hormones can stimulate smooth muscle, okay, and they can inhibit smooth muscle, but not skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is stimulated by motor neurons, not hormones, okay. Stretching can trigger smooth muscle contraction, so there's ways at which the movement of the muscle can cause a contraction. They typically are much slower to contract and relax, so the latent period is greater. Okay, they are very resistant to fatigue. Just in general, we often think of smooth muscle not fatiguing. Okay, that doesn't mean you can't fatigue them, but for the most part, it's a pretty good source that you're not going to fatigue them. And they can change the length without changing the tautness. Okay, and this is kind of important. So the length of the muscle can change, but you're not changing. You're not changing how like it contracts, or you're not changing the actual form of the muscle. So you're not creating a bulbous or something like that. So when your intestines are stretching to allow material to move, okay, it's not creating a bump like a muscular, like it's not flexing on one side. So the tautness is not changing. Okay. Next time out, we'll talk about the last type of muscle, cardiac, and a few other things like diseases and disorders.